Hi, Ezra. So we're back with chapter 2, The Thrush's Nest. Shelley was a young gentleman, and as grown-ups as he... Let's start over. Shelley was a young gentleman, and as grown-up as he need ever expected to be. He was a poet, and they are never exactly grown up. They are people who despise money except what you need for day to day. And he had all that and 5 pounds over. So when he was walking in the Kingston Gardens, he made a paper boat of his banknote and sent it sailing on the Serpentine. It reached an island at night, and the lookout brought it to Solomon's call, who thought at first that it was the usual thing, a message from a lady saying she would be obligated if he would let her have a good one. They always ask for the best one he has, and if he likes the letter, he sends one from Class A. But if it ruffles him, he sends very funny ones indeed. Sometimes he sends none at all, and at another time he sends a nestful. It all depends on the mood you catch him in. He likes you to leave it all to him, and if you mention particularly that you hope he will see his way to making it a boy this time, he is almost sure to send another girl. And whether you are a lady or only a little boy who wants a baby sister, always take pains to write your address clearly. You can't think what a lot of babies of Solomon has sent to the wrong house. Shelley's boat, when opened, completely puzzled Solomon, and he took counsel of his assistants, who, having walked over it twice, first with their toes pointed out, and then with their toes pointed in, decided that it came from some greedy person who wanted 5. They thought this because there was a large 5 printed on it. Preposterous, cried Solomon in a rage, and he presented it to Peter. Anything useless which drifted upon the island was usually given to Peter as a plaything. But he did not play with this precious banknote, for he knew what it was at once, having been very observant during the week when he was an ordinary boy. With so much money, he reflected, he could surely at last contrive to reach the gardens, and he considered all the possible ways and decided, wisely I think, to choose the best way. But first he had to tell the birds of the value of Shelley's boat. And though they were too honest to demand it back, he saw that they were galled, and they cast such blank looks at Solomon, who was rather vain of his cleverness, that he threw away to the end of the island and sat there very depressed with his head buried in his wings. Now Peter knew that unless Solomon was on your side, you never got anything done for you in the island, as he followed him and tried to hearten him. Nor was this all that Peter did to gain the powerful old fellow's goodwill. You must know that Solomon had no intention of remaining in office all his life. He looked forward to retiring by and by and devoting his green old age to a life of pleasure on a certain yew stub in the figs which had taken his fancy, and for years he had been quietly filling his stocking. It was a stocking belonging to some bathing person who had just been cast upon the island, and at that time, I speak of, it contained 180 crumbs, 34 nuts, 16 crusts, and a pepper whipper and a bootlace. When his stocking was full, Solomon calculated that he would be able to retire on a compensate. Doesn't make sense. Peter now gave him £1. He cut it off his banknote with a sharp stick. This made Solomon his friend forever, and after the two had consulted together, they called a meeting of the thrushes. You will see presently why thrushes only were invited. The scheme to put before them was really Peter's, but Solomon did most of the talking, because he soon became irritable if other people talked. He began by saying that he had been much impressed by the superior ingenuity shown. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to me. Now where was I? by the thrushes in the nesting building, and this put them into a good humor at once, as it was meant to be, for all the quarrels between birds are about the best way of building nests. Other birds, said Solomon, opted to line their nests with mud, and as a result they did not hold water. There he cocked his head as if he had used an unanswerable argument. But unfortunately, a Mrs. Finch had come to the meeting uninvited, and she squeaked out, "You don't build a nest to hold water, but to hold eggs." And then the thrushes stopped cheering, and Solomon was so perplexed that he took several sips of water. "Consider," he said at last, "how warm the mud makes the nest." "Consider," cried Miss Finch, "that when water gets into the nest, it remains there, and your little ones are drowned." The thrushes begged Solomon with a look to say something crushing in reply to this, but again he was perplexed. "Try another drink," suggested Mrs. Finch pertly. Kate was her name, and all Kates are saucy. Solomon did try another drink, and it inspired him. "If," said he, "a finch's nest is placed on the serpentine, it fills and breaks to pieces, but a thrush's nest is still as dry as the cup of a swan's back." How the thrushes applauded. Now they knew they lined their nest with mud, and when Miss Finch called out, "We don't place our nest on the serpentine," they did what they should have done at first, chased her from the meeting. After this, it was most ordinary. What they had been brought together to hear, said Solomon, was this: their young friend Peter Pan, as they well knew, wanted very much to be able to cross the gardens, and he now proposed, with their help, to build a boat. At this, the thrushes began to fidget, which made Peter tremble for his scheme. Solomon explained hastily that what he meant was not one of the cumbersome boats that humans use. The proposed boat was to be simply a thrush's nest, large enough to hold Peter. But still, to Peter's agony, the thrushes were sulky. "We are very busy people," they grumbled, "and this would be a big job." But still, to Peter's agony, the thrushes... "Oh, quite so," said Solomon. "And of course, Peter would not allow you to work for nothing. You must remember that he is now in comfortable circumstances, and he will pay you such wages as you have never been paid before. Peter Pan authorized me to say that you shall be paid 6 pence a day." Well, all the thrushes hopped for joy, and that very day was begun the celebrating building of the boat. All their ordinary business fell into a raise, as it was the time of the year when they should have been pairing, but not a thrush's nest was built except this big one, and so Solomon soon ran short of thrushes with which to supply the demands of the mainland. The stout, rather greedy children who took so well in permalatory, but get huffed easily when they walk, were all young thrushes once, and ladies often asked especially for them. What do you think Solomon did? He sent over to the housetops for a lot of the sparrows and ordered them to lay their eggs in old thrushes' nests, and sent their young to the ladies and swore they were all thrushes. It was known afterwards on the island as the sparrows' year, and so when you meet, as you doubtlessly sometimes do, grown-up people who puff and blow as if they thought themselves bigger than they are, very likely they belong to that year. You ask them. Peter was a just master and paid his work people every evening. They stood in rows on the branches, waiting politely while he cut the paper 6 pences out of his banknote and presented it. And presentedly he called the roll, and each bird, as the names were mentioned, flew down and got 6 pence. It must have been a fight to see. And at last, after months of labor, the boat was finished. Oh, the deportment of Peter, he saw it growing. On the deportment of Peter, as he saw it growing more and more like a great thrush's nest. For the very beginning of the building of it For the very beginning of the building of it, he slept by its side and often woke up to say sweet things to it. And after it was lined with mud and the mud had dried, he always slept in it. He sleeps in the nest still and has a fascinating way of curling around in it, for it's just large enough to hold him comfortably when he curls round like a kitten. It is brown inside, of course, but outside is mostly green, being woven of grass and twigs, and when those withers snap, the walls are thrashed afresh. There are also a few feathers here and there, which came from the thrushes while they were building. The other birds were extremely jealous and said that the boat would not balance on the water, but it lay most beautifully steady. They said the water would come into it, but no water came into it. Next, they said that Peter with no oars, and this caused the thrushes to look at each other in dismay. But Peter replied that he had no need of oars, and he had a sail. And with such a proud and happy face, he produced a sail from which he had fashioned out of his nightgown. And though it was still rather like a nightgown, it made a lovely sail. And that night, the moon being full and all the birds asleep, he did enter his coordinates as Master Francis Petty, who have said, the department and departed out of the island. And first he knew not why, he looked upward with his hands clasped, and from that moment his eyes were pinned to the west. Breathing, no, that's not your book. He had promised the thrushes to begin by making short voyages with them as his guide, but far away he saw the Kensington Gardens beckoning to him beneath the bridge, and he could not wait. His face was flushed, but he never looked back. There was an exultation in his little breast that drove out fear. Was Peter the least gallant of the English mariners who have sailed westward to meet the unknown? At first, his boat turned round and round, and he was driven back to the place of his start. Where often he shortened his sails by removing one of the sleeves, and was forthwith carried backward by a contrary breeze to his no small peril. He now let go of the sail, and the results that he was drifted toward the far shore were all black shadows he knew not the dangers of, but suspected them, and so once more hoisted his nightgown and went rumor of the shadows until he caught a favoring wind, which bore him westward, but at so great a speed that he was like to be broken against the bridge, which having avoided, he passed under the bridge and came to this great rejoicing, within full sight of the delectable gardens, but having tried to cast anchor, which was a stone at the end of a piece of a kite string, he found no bottom, and was fain to hold off, seeking for mooring, and feeling his way, he buffeted against a sunken reef that cast him overboard by the greatness of the shock, and he was near being drowned, but clambered back into the vessel. There now arose a mighty storm, accomplished by roaring of the water, such as he had never heard the like, and he was tossed this way and that, his hands so numb with the cold that he could not close them, having escaped the danger of which he was mercifully carried into a small bay where his boat rode at peace. Nevertheless, he was not yet in safety, for on pretending to disembark, he found a multitude of small people drawn up on the shore to contest his landing, and thrilling to him to be off, for it was long past lockout time. This was much brandish of their holy leaves, and also, I bet you it's fairies. And also accompanied them carried an arrow which some boy had left in the gardens. And this they were prepared to use as a battering ram. Then Peter, who knew them for the fairies, called out that he was not an ordinary human, and had no desire to do them displeasure, but to befriend nevertheless, Having found a jolly harbor, he was in no temper to draw off their form, and he warned them if they sought to mischief him, to stand to their harms. So, again, doesn't make sense to me. So saying, he boldly leapt ashore, and they gathered around him with intent to slay him. But there arose a great cry among the women, and it was because they now observed that his sail was a baby's nightgown. Whereupon they straightway loved him, and grieved that their laps were too small, and which I cannot explain except by saying that such is the way of women. The men fairies now seized their weapons on observing the behavior of the women, on whose intelligence they set great store, and they led chivalry to their queen, who conferred upon him the courtesy of the gardens after lockout time. And henceforth Peter could go wherever he chose, and the fairies had orders to put him in comfort. Such was his first voyage to the gardens, and you may gather from the antiquity of the language that it took place a long time ago. Yes, very long time ago. But Peter never grows any older, and if we could be watching for him under the bridge tonight, but of course we can't, I dare say he should see him hoisting his nightgown and sailing, or paddling us in the thrush's nest. When he sails, he sits down, but he stands up to paddle. I shall tell you precisely how he got his paddle. Long before the time of the opening of the gates comes, he steals back to the island, for people must not see him. He is not so human as all that. But this gives him hours for play, and he plays exactly as children play. At least he thinks so, and this is one of the pathetic things about him, that he often plays quite wrongly. You see, had he no one to tell him how children really play, for the fairies were all more or less in hiding until dusk, and so know nothing, and though the birds pretending that they could tell him a great deal, when the time for the telling came, it was wonderful how little they really knew. They told him the truth about hide and seek, and he often plays it by himself. But even no, Raven, no, come lay down, come sit and listen. They tell him the truth about hide and seek, and he often plays it by himself. But even the ducks on the round pond could not explain to him what it is that makes the pond so fascinating to boys. Every night, the ducks have forgotten all the events of the day, except the number of pieces of cake thrown to them. They are gloomy creatures and say that cake is not what it is in their younger days. Raven, no. So Peter had to find out many things for himself. He often played ship at the round pond, but his ship was only a hoop which he had found on the grass. Of course, he had never seen a hoop, and he wondered what you play at with them, and decided that you play at pretending they are boats. This hoop always sank at once, but he waited for it, and sometimes he dragged it gleefully around the rim of the pond, and he was quite proud to think that he had discovered what boys do with hoops. Boys don't do that with hoops. Another time, when he found a child's pail, he thought it was for sitting in, and he sat so hard in it that he could scarcely get out of it. Also, he found a balloon. It was bobbing about on the hump, quite as if it was having a game by itself, and he caught it after an exciting chase, but he thought it was a ball. So he kicked it, and after that he could not find it anywhere. Perhaps the most surprising thing he found was a perambulator. I don't know. It's a prom. That's what it is. It was under a lime tree near the entrance of the Fairy Queen's winter palace, which is within the circle of the 7 Spanish chestnuts. And Peter approached it warily, for the birds had never mentioned such things to him. Least it was alive, he addressed it politely, and then, as it gave no answer, he went nearer and felt it cautiously. He gave it a little push, and it ran from him, which made him think it must be alive after all. But as he had run from him, he was not afraid, so he stretched out his hand to pull it to him. But this time it ran at him, and he was so alarmed that he leapt the railing and scuttled away to his boat. You must not think, however, that he was a coward, for he came back to the next night with a crust in one hand and a stick in the other. But the perm, not the perm, had gone. The prom had gone, and he never saw another one. I had promised to tell you also about his paddle. It was a child's spade, which he had found near St. Grove's Well, and he thought it was a paddle. Do you pity Peter Pan for making these mistakes? If so, I think it rather silly of you. What I mean is that, of course, Raven, stop. Of course one must pity him now and then, but to pity him all the time would be impertinence. He thought he had the most splendid time in the gardens, and to think you have it is almost quite as good as really to have it. He played without ceasing, while you often waste time by being Mad Dog or Mary Annish. He could be neither of those things, for he had never heard of them. But do you think he is to be pitied for that? No, he made up his own games, which is very fun. Oh, he was merry. He was as much merry than you. For instance, as you were merrier than your father, sometimes he fell like a spinning top from sheer merriment. Have you seen a greyhound leaping the fences of the garden? That is how Peter leaps them. And think of the music of his pipe. Gentlemen who walk home at night write to their papers to say they had heard a nightingale in the gardens, but it is really Peter's pipe they hear. Of course, he had no mother, at least. What use was she to him? You can be sorry for him for that. But don't be too sorry, for the next thing I mean to tell you is how he revisited her. It was the fairies who gave him the chance. See his little naked bottom? Because he doesn't need clothes. And that's the end of that. I wonder how he's going to revisit his mom. So the next chapter, lockout time. Oh, Raven is wanting to read more. But we will read more next time. Nonnie loves you, Ezra.